My daughter-in-law Amanda said I was too controlling, too interfering, and too much of a threat to her marriage. So she started excluding me from family events, poisoning my son against me, and demanding that he choose between his wife and his mother. But I wasn't controlling. I wasn't interfering. While she thought I'd quietly accept being pushed out of my son's life to make room for her insecurities, I was already planning to show her what losing family really looked like. This is how I taught the daughter-in-law who wanted to erase me what it meant to have no family support at all, and how I made sure she understood the difference between setting boundaries and burning bridges with the only people who truly cared about her well-being. I raised my son Michael as a single mother after his father died in a construction accident when Michael was just 4 years old. The insurance settlement was modest, so I worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat: mornings at a medical office, afternoons cleaning houses, evenings waitressing at a diner. Michael never knew about the nights I fell asleep standing up or the meals I skipped so he could have everything he needed. Every sacrifice was worth it when I watched Michael grow into a successful, caring man. He excelled in school, earned a scholarship to engineering college, and landed a great job at a tech company right after graduation. At 28, he was financially stable, emotionally mature, and ready to build a family of his own. I was so proud of the man he'd become and excited about the next chapter of our close relationship. Then he met Amanda at a work conference and everything changed. Amanda was beautiful, ambitious, and came from a wealthy family that had given her every advantage. She'd attended private schools, traveled extensively, and never worked a job she actually needed for survival. She was polished in ways I'd never had the opportunity to become, sophisticated in ways that hard work and sacrifice don't teach you. At first, I was thrilled that Michael had found someone who made him happy. Amanda seemed lovely during our initial meetings, and I went out of my way to welcome her into our family. I invited her to our traditional Sunday dinners, included her in holiday celebrations, and made genuine efforts to get to know her interests and background. But as their relationship became more serious, Amanda's attitude toward me began to shift in subtle ways that made me increasingly uncomfortable. She would make small comments about how close Michael and I were, suggesting that our relationship was somehow inappropriate or unhealthy. She'd roll her eyes when Michael called me or mention how unusual it was for a grown man to talk to his mother so frequently. When Michael proposed and they started planning their wedding, Amanda's campaign to distance him from me intensified. She questioned every tradition I suggested, dismissed family customs as outdated, and made it clear that she wanted their new family to operate according to her preferences rather than building on the foundation Michael and I had established over 24 years. The first real betrayal came during the wedding planning when Amanda decided that our traditional Sunday dinners needed to be restructured to accommodate their new relationship. For 24 years, Michael had joined me for dinner every Sunday, a tradition we'd maintained even when he moved into his own apartment. It was our sacred time to catch up, share our weeks, and maintain the close bond that had sustained us through everything. I think it's important for couples to establish their own traditions, Amanda announced during one of our dinners, looking directly at me rather than including me in the conversation. Michael and I need time to build our relationship without constantly accommodating other people's expectations. The phrase, other people's expectations, was clearly directed at me, as if my desire to continue our family tradition was some kind of unreasonable demand. When I suggested we could alternate weekends or include Amanda in our tradition, she responded with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I appreciate the offer, but I think it's healthier for Michael to focus on our relationship right now. We can do family dinners occasionally, but not every week. That's just too much. The second betrayal came during the actual wedding planning, when Amanda made it clear that my input was not welcome in decisions about their ceremony and reception. I had saved money for years to contribute to Michael's wedding, wanting to help create the beautiful celebration he deserved. When I offered to pay for the flowers or the music, Amanda politely declined, explaining that she and her parents had everything handled. But when I suggested small touches that honored our family, like including Michael's father's favorite song in the ceremony or serving his grandmother's signature dessert at the reception, Amanda dismissed these ideas as not fitting with our vision. She wanted their wedding to reflect her aesthetics and preferences, with no acknowledgement of the family Michael came from. The third betrayal was Amanda's systematic campaign to reframe my relationship with Michael as unhealthy and inappropriate. She would make comments to mutual friends about how attached Michael was to his mother, suggesting that our close relationship was somehow preventing him from fully committing to marriage. "I just want him to be able to be independent," she would say with concern in her voice, as if my son's success, emotional maturity, and ability to maintain loving relationships were evidence of dependence rather than the results of good parenting. She made it sound like she was rescuing Michael from an overbearing mother rather than asking him to abandon the person who devoted her life to his well-being. The breaking point came 6 months after Michael and Amanda's wedding, when they announced Amanda's pregnancy during what had become our monthly family dinner. I was genuinely thrilled about becoming a grandmother and told them how excited I was to help with the baby in any way I could. Amanda's response to my enthusiasm was swift and devastating. "Actually, we've been talking about boundaries around the baby," she said, her hand protectively over her barely visible bump. "We want to make sure we establish healthy patterns from the beginning, so the baby grows up understanding that Michael and I are the parents and decision makers." When I asked what that meant practically, Amanda launched into what was clearly a rehearsed speech about grandparent boundaries. I wouldn't be allowed to babysit overnight until the baby was at least 6 months old. I wouldn't be consulted about major decisions like childcare, education, or medical choices. I wouldn't be given a key to their house for safety reasons. And most importantly, I needed to understand that their child would be raised according to their values and preferences, not family traditions or expectations. "We appreciate that you want to be involved," Amanda continued, "but we need you to respect that this is our family now and we get to decide how it operates. The baby will have one set of parents, not a committee of relatives trying to influence every decision." But the words that shattered my heart completely came from Michael himself. When I looked to him for support, for some acknowledgement that his mother's desire to be involved in her grandchild's life was normal and loving, he sided completely with his wife. "Mom, I think Amanda's right," he said, not meeting my eyes. "We need to establish boundaries now so there's no confusion later. You've always been very involved in my life and that was fine when I was single. But now I have a wife and soon a baby and they have to come first." Amanda's final blow was delivered with surgical precision. "You're not our family. Michael and I are family. The baby will be our family. You're Michael's mother, which means you're an extended relative who will be included when appropriate and when it doesn't interfere with our family's needs." That night, I made a decision that would change all of our lives forever. If Amanda wanted to exclude me from their family, if she wanted me treated as an extended relative whose involvement was optional and inconvenient, then I would give her exactly what she'd asked for. She would learn what it actually meant to have no family support, no backup when things got difficult, no unconditional love to fall back on when life became challenging. The morning after Amanda's devastating announcement about grandparent boundaries, I began the systematic process of withdrawing from Michael's life in exactly the way she demanded. This wasn't going to be an emotional reaction or a temporary punishment. It was going to be a complete restructuring of my relationship with them to reflect the extended relative status Amanda had assigned me. If Amanda wanted me to understand that I wasn't their family, then I would stop behaving like family. If she wanted boundaries around my involvement in their lives, then I would establish boundaries around my availability to them. If she wanted me treated as an optional presence who could be included when convenient, then I would become genuinely optional. I started by removing myself from all the ways I'd been providing ongoing support to Michael and Amanda without them even realizing it. For years, I'd been Michael's emergency contact, his backup plan, his reliable resource for everything from practical advice to financial assistance. Now I began systematically removing myself from that support role. I contacted Michael's employer and asked that my name be removed as his emergency contact. I did the same with his doctor's office, his insurance company, and anywhere else my name appeared as his backup person. I stopped offering the kind of practical help that Amanda clearly saw as interference rather than support. Most importantly, I began treating their pregnancy and future child exactly as Amanda had requested, as something that wasn't my concern or responsibility. I stopped asking about doctor's appointments, stopped offering advice about baby preparations, stopped expressing excitement about becoming a grandmother. I also started building a life that didn't include them or revolve around their needs and schedules. I joined a book club, started taking art classes, and began volunteering at a local animal shelter. For the first time in 24 years, I was creating an identity that had nothing to do with being Michael's mother. Within 3 months, I'd completely restructured my relationship with Michael and Amanda. Instead of the devoted mother and enthusiastic future grandmother who'd been eager to support their new family, I'd become someone who treated them with polite distance. Amanda had wanted me to understand that I wasn't their family, and I'd accepted that designation completely. My plan to show Amanda what life without family support actually looked like went into full effect during the spring of her pregnancy, as the reality of impending parenthood began to create practical and emotional challenges that she'd never anticipated. Instead of offering the help and support that any normal grandmother would provide, I maintained the boundaries Amanda had requested with perfect consistency. When she mentioned being overwhelmed by baby registry decisions, I listened politely without offering advice. When she complained about the cost of quality baby furniture, I expressed sympathy without offering to help financially. When she seemed anxious about upcoming medical appointments, I didn't offer to accompany her or provide reassurance. The contrast between my behavior and what she'd probably expected became apparent when Amanda started making subtle requests for exactly the kind of involvement she'd previously rejected. During one of our increasingly rare dinners together, she mentioned that her own mother was too busy with social commitments to help much with baby preparations. "It's just overwhelming," Amanda said, looking tired and stressed. "There are so many decisions to make and I don't really know what I'm doing. My mom keeps saying she'll help, but then she's always busy with her charity work or travel plans." She glanced at me hopefully, as if expecting me to immediately offer the assistance she'd previously rejected. My response was perfectly consistent with the boundaries she'd established. "I'm sure you'll figure it out. You're both intelligent, capable people." When she pressed for more specific guidance, I reminded her gently that she'd wanted to make these decisions independently without family interference. The most telling moment came when Amanda realized that pregnancy and new parenthood would require the kind of practical support system that she'd systematically dismantled. Her own parents lived across the country and were largely uninvolved in day-to-day life. Her friends were mostly single or childless professionals who had no experience with babies. "I've been thinking," Amanda said during one conversation, "maybe it would be helpful if you could be more involved after the baby comes. Just for practical things like maybe helping with meals or holding the baby while I shower." The request was exactly the kind of grandmother involvement she'd previously characterized as unhealthy boundary crossing. My response was calm and matter-of-fact. "Amanda, you were very clear about wanting to establish boundaries around my involvement with the baby. I respect those boundaries and don't want to overstep them. You and Michael are the parents, and you get to decide how to handle childcare and household responsibilities." As Amanda's pregnancy progressed, the consequences of her boundary setting became more apparent. When she went into early labor and needed emergency childcare for their dog, they had to pay for expensive pet boarding because I wasn't available as backup. When she needed someone to drive her to a late-night medical appointment because Michael was out of town, she had to call an expensive taxi service. The baby arrived in early summer, a beautiful little girl they named Sophie. Instead of the involved, supportive grandmother I would have naturally become, I maintained the role of distant, extended relative that Amanda had assigned me. I visited once in the hospital with flowers and a generic gift, stayed for exactly 30 minutes, and left without offering ongoing help. The complete devastation of Amanda's carefully constructed family independence began to unfold when Sophie was 6 months old and the reality of long-term parenting without family support became unsustainable. What had started as Amanda's desire to establish boundaries and control had evolved into a crushing isolation that affected every aspect of her daily life and mental health. The first major crisis came when Amanda developed postpartum depression, something that might have been caught and addressed earlier if she'd had the kind of involved family support that notices changes in a new mother's behavior and well-being. Instead, Amanda struggled alone with feelings of inadequacy, exhaustion, and hopelessness while trying to maintain the facade that she was managing parenthood successfully without anyone's help. When Michael finally recognized that Amanda needed professional help, he called me in a panic. "Mom, I think something's really wrong with Amanda. She's not eating, she barely sleeps, and she keeps saying she's a terrible mother. I don't know what to do and I'm scared." For the first time since Sophie's birth, he sounded like the son who used to turn to me for guidance and support when facing challenges beyond his experience. My response was measured and consistent with the boundaries Amanda had established. "That sounds very difficult for both of you. Have you encouraged Amanda to speak with her doctor about how she's feeling? Postpartum depression is serious, and she should get professional help rather than trying to handle this alone." "But Mom," Michael pleaded, "couldn't you maybe come over and help with Sophie while Amanda rests? Or maybe talk to Amanda about what it was like when you had me. She might listen to someone who's been through this before." The request was exactly the kind of family support that any grandmother would naturally provide, but it was also exactly what Amanda had rejected as inappropriate interference. "Michael, Amanda was very clear that she wanted to handle parenting decisions independently without family interference. I don't want to overstep those boundaries by offering unsolicited advice or help. She should work with her healthcare providers to develop a treatment plan that works for her situation." The conversation revealed how completely unprepared Michael was to handle a mental health crisis without the family support system he'd taken for granted his entire life. He'd grown up knowing that his mother would be available for any emergency, ready with practical solutions and emotional support whenever life became overwhelming. Now, faced with his wife's depression and a 6-month-old baby, he discovered what it meant to have no family backup when professional help wasn't immediately available. Amanda's postpartum depression worsened over the following weeks, partly because she had no support system to help her recognize that her feelings were temporary and treatable rather than evidence of her failure as a mother. The isolation she'd created meant that she was processing these difficult emotions entirely alone, without the reassurance and perspective that family members typically provide during postpartum recovery. The situation became critical when Amanda called me one afternoon, sobbing hysterically while Sophie cried in the background. "I can't do this," she wailed into the phone. "I'm a terrible mother, Sophie hates me, nothing I do makes her happy, and I think she'd be better off without me. I don't know why I thought I could handle having a baby." The call was clearly a cry for help from someone experiencing a mental health emergency, exactly the kind of situation where any grandmother would immediately rush over to provide support and ensure everyone's safety. Instead, I responded with the same polite distance Amanda had demanded. "Amanda, those feelings sound very concerning. You should call your doctor immediately or go to the emergency room if you're having thoughts about harming yourself or Sophie. This sounds like something that requires professional intervention." "Please," Amanda begged, "could you just come over and help me figure out what's wrong with Sophie? I feel like I'm going crazy and I don't know what else to do. Michael's at work, I can't reach my mom, and I'm all alone with a baby who won't stop crying." The desperation in her voice was heartbreaking, but I maintained the boundaries she'd established with perfect consistency. "I understand you're feeling overwhelmed, but you specifically asked me not to interfere with your parenting or offer unsolicited advice about Sophie. You're her mother, and you're the person responsible for making decisions about her care. If you're concerned about her crying, you should contact your pediatrician." The phone call ended with Amanda hanging up, still crying, still alone with her distress and a fussy baby. Later that evening, Michael called to tell me that Amanda had taken Sophie to the emergency room, convinced something was medically wrong, only to be told that the baby was perfectly healthy and that Amanda's anxiety was likely related to her untreated postpartum depression. "The doctor said Amanda needs more support at home," Michael told me, his voice heavy with exhaustion and worry. He said new mothers shouldn't be handling everything alone, that family support is crucial for recovery from postpartum depression. "Mom, I know you're respecting Amanda's boundaries, but I think we need help. Could you maybe bend the rules just a little?" The request revealed how little Michael understood about the consequences of the boundaries his wife had established. He wanted me to be available for emergencies while respecting Amanda's desire for independence during normal times. He wanted family support when it was convenient while maintaining the distance Amanda had demanded when my involvement felt threatening to her control. Michael, I said gently, Amanda was very explicit about wanting to establish healthy boundaries around my involvement in your family. She said you needed to understand that your primary loyalty was to her, not to me, and that I wasn't part of your family unit. I'm respecting those boundaries exactly as she requested. If she wants different boundaries now, she needs to communicate that directly. The conversation forced Michael to confront the reality that his wife's boundary setting hadn't been about healthy independence. It had been about control and exclusion that was now creating serious problems for their family's well-being and stability. The crisis deepened when Amanda's postpartum depression led to a complete breakdown in her ability to function as Sophie's primary caregiver. She would sit for hours holding the baby, crying about her inadequacy as a mother, unable to make basic decisions about feeding, sleeping, or daily routines. Michael found himself trying to work full-time while managing most of Sophie's care and Amanda's mental health crisis, with no family support to help distribute the overwhelming responsibilities. The turning point came when Michael had to travel for a 3-day work conference that he couldn't postpone. In a healthy family system, this would have been a perfect opportunity for grandparent support. I could have stayed with Amanda and Sophie, providing both practical help and emotional reassurance during a difficult period. Instead, Amanda faced the prospect of being alone with the baby for 3 days while struggling with untreated depression and anxiety. Mom, Michael called me 2 days before his departure. I'm really scared to leave Amanda alone with Sophie. She's not doing well, and I don't think it's safe for her to handle everything by herself for 3 days. Her parents can't come and we don't have anyone else. Could you possibly stay with them while I'm gone? The request was reasonable and necessary, exactly the kind of family emergency where any grandmother would immediately step in to ensure everyone's safety and well-being. My response was careful and consistent. That sounds like a very difficult situation. Have you considered hiring a professional nanny or asking Amanda's parents to change their plans? Amanda was clear that she wanted to handle parenting independently, and I don't want to interfere with that independence. But this is an emergency, Michael protested. Amanda's not thinking clearly. Sophie needs constant care and I have to go to this conference. What if something happens while I'm gone? The fear in his voice was genuine. He was recognizing that the isolation Amanda had created was now endangering their family's safety and stability. Michael, if you're genuinely concerned about Amanda's ability to care for Sophie safely, you should contact her doctor about getting additional mental health support or consider postponing your trip. These are serious parenting decisions that Amanda said she wanted to make independently without family interference. The conference proceeded as scheduled because Michael couldn't afford to miss an important career opportunity, leaving Amanda alone with Sophie for 3 days during the worst period of her postpartum depression. The experience was devastating for Amanda, who spent 72 hours in a state of near-constant anxiety and despair, convinced she was failing as a mother while having no support system to provide perspective or assistance. When Michael returned, he found Amanda in a state of complete emotional collapse. She hadn't slept more than a few hours total, had barely eaten, and was convinced that Sophie would be better off with different parents. "I can't do this anymore," she told Michael through tears. "I'm not cut out to be a mother, and Sophie deserves better than me. Maybe we should consider giving her to someone who actually knows what they're doing." The statement was a clear indication that Amanda's mental health had deteriorated to a dangerous level, partly because she had no family support system to provide reassurance, practical help, and perspective during her recovery from postpartum depression. The independence she'd demanded had become a prison of isolation that was threatening her ability to function as a parent. Michael called me that evening, more frightened than I'd ever heard him. "Mom, I think Amanda might hurt herself or Sophie. She keeps talking about being a failure and how Sophie would be better off without her. The doctor says she needs intensive support, but her parents live too far away to help regularly. I don't know what to do anymore." For the first time, Michael was directly acknowledging that Amanda's boundary setting had created a crisis that required family intervention. The request for help was urgent and desperate, exactly the kind of emergency that would normally prompt immediate grandmother involvement. Instead, I responded with the same boundaries Amanda had established. "That sounds extremely concerning, Michael. You should contact Amanda's doctor immediately about getting her additional mental health treatment or possibly hospitalization if she's having thoughts of self-harm. This is clearly beyond what you can handle alone, and Amanda needs professional intervention. But couldn't you at least come over and help with Sophie while we figure out Amanda's treatment? Michael pleaded. I'm exhausted. Amanda can barely function and Sophie needs consistent care. We don't have anyone else to ask. The plea was heartbreaking because it revealed how completely Amanda had isolated their family from the very support system that could have prevented this crisis from becoming so severe. Michael, I understand this is frightening and overwhelming. But Amanda was very explicit about not wanting me involved in Sophie's care or your family decisions. If she wants me to help, she needs to ask me directly and acknowledge that the boundaries she established aren't working for your family's needs. The conversation ended with Michael realizing that his wife's campaign to exclude me from their lives had created exactly the independence she'd demanded: complete responsibility for their family's well-being with no backup support when things became too difficult to handle alone. Over the following weeks, as Amanda began intensive treatment for postpartum depression, the full cost of her boundary setting became apparent. Every therapy appointment required expensive childcare because there was no family member available to watch Sophie. Every crisis required professional intervention because there was no extended family to provide emergency support. Every moment of doubt or confusion had to be processed without the reassurance and wisdom that grandparents typically offer to struggling new parents. The most devastating realization came when Amanda's therapist suggested that family support would be crucial for her recovery, but that the isolation she'd created had eliminated the very relationships that could provide that support. Family involvement is often essential for postpartum depression recovery, the therapist explained during a session that Michael attended. New mothers need reassurance, practical help, and perspective from people who love them unconditionally. Social isolation tends to worsen depression and anxiety. When the therapist asked about available family support, Michael had to explain that they'd chosen to limit grandparent involvement to maintain independence and healthy boundaries. The therapist's response was direct and challenging. It sounds like those boundaries may have been counterproductive for your family's well-being. Healthy boundaries include family support during difficult times, not isolation from people who care about you. The therapy sessions forced Amanda to confront the reality that her desire to control and exclude me had eliminated exactly the support system she desperately needed during the most challenging period of her life. She'd convinced herself that independence meant isolation, that boundaries meant cutting off relationships, that strength meant handling everything alone. The breaking point in Amanda's recovery came when Sophie, now 8 months old, had a febrile seizure that required emergency hospitalization. Amanda was alone with the baby when it happened, and she completely panicked, unable to think clearly or take appropriate action. By the time paramedics arrived, Amanda was hysterical and Sophie needed immediate medical attention. At the hospital, as doctors worked to stabilize Sophie's condition, Amanda sat in the waiting room sobbing uncontrollably, overwhelmed by guilt and terror. I didn't know what to do, she kept repeating. I should have known what to do, but I panicked and made everything worse. What kind of mother am I? Michael called me from the hospital, his voice shaking with fear and exhaustion. Mom, Sophie had a seizure and Amanda completely fell apart. She's blaming herself, saying she's not fit to be a mother and I don't know how to help her anymore. We're all alone here and I feel like we're drowning. The desperation in his voice was heartbreaking, but I maintained consistency with Amanda's established boundaries. That sounds terrifying for both of you. I'm sure the doctors are taking excellent care of Sophie, and seizures in babies are often less serious than they appear. Amanda should focus on following the medical team's guidance rather than blaming herself for a medical emergency. Please, Mom, Michael begged, could you just come to the hospital? Amanda needs someone who understands what it's like to be scared for your child. She needs family support right now, even if it's just someone sitting with her while we wait for news about Sophie. The request was simple and reasonable. Exactly what any grandmother would do in a medical emergency involving her grandchild. My response was gentle but firm. Michael, Amanda was very clear that she didn't want me involved in Sophie's medical care or major family crises. I don't want to overstep those boundaries during an already stressful situation. Amanda has you for support, and that should be sufficient based on the family structure she established. The conversation ended with Michael understanding that the isolation Amanda had demanded meant facing their worst fears alone, without the extended family support that most people take for granted during medical emergencies and family crises. Sophie's seizure turned out to be a common febrile seizure with no lasting effects, but the experience shattered Amanda's confidence as a mother and forced her to confront the consequences of the boundaries she'd established. As she sat in that hospital waiting room, terrified and alone except for Michael, she realized that the independence she demanded had become a trap that prevented her from accessing the very support she needed most. The aftermath of Sophie's medical emergency became a turning point in Amanda's understanding of what she'd lost when she'd systematically excluded me from their family. The therapy sessions that followed focused on her recognition that healthy families include multiple generations of support, that boundaries should enhance relationships rather than eliminate them, and that her desire for control had created dangerous isolation during times when family support was crucial. But the damage had been done. The trust and closeness that could have existed between a grandmother and her son's family had been systematically destroyed by Amanda's need to control and exclude. The support system that could have prevented her postpartum depression from becoming so severe, that could have provided guidance during medical emergencies, that could have offered the wisdom and reassurance new parents desperately need, was no longer available because she'd burned those bridges in her campaign to establish dominance over Michael's family loyalties. Amanda had gotten exactly what she'd demanded: complete independence from family interference, total control over family decisions, and absolute responsibility for all outcomes. She'd learned the hard way that independence without support becomes isolation, that control without wisdom becomes chaos, and that families who exclude loving relatives often find themselves facing life's challenges completely alone. The woman who'd wanted to cut me out of their lives had successfully achieved her goal, but the cost was far higher than she'd ever imagined. She traded a lifetime of unconditional family support for the illusion of control, and when life became more difficult than she could handle alone, she discovered that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. 3 years have passed since Amanda systematically excluded me from Michael and Sophie's lives in her campaign to establish complete control over their family structure. The consequences of her boundary setting have shaped their family in ways that none of us could have predicted, creating lasting changes in relationships that might otherwise have been sources of strength and support for decades to come. Amanda did eventually recover from her postpartum depression, but the process was longer and more difficult than it needed to be because she lacked the family support system that typically helps new mothers navigate mental health challenges. Her therapy focused heavily on understanding how her need for control had created dangerous isolation, but insight doesn't automatically repair relationships that have been systematically damaged. Sophie is now a bright, healthy 3-year-old who barely knows me. Amanda's boundary setting succeeded in preventing the close grandmother-granddaughter relationship that might have developed naturally, but it also deprived Sophie of the additional love, support, and family connection that grandparents typically provide. Sophie has grown up with essentially one set of involved relatives, Amanda's distant, busy parents who visit occasionally but aren't available for day-to-day support. Michael has struggled with the loss of our previously close relationship more than Amanda anticipated. The son who used to call me several times a week now speaks to me perhaps once a month, and our conversations are polite but distant. He's learned to handle life's challenges without the family support he'd relied on his entire life, but the transition was difficult and lonely. The most significant consequence has been the complete absence of the multigenerational support system that most families take for granted. When Sophie gets sick, Michael and Amanda handle everything alone. When they face financial stress, parenting challenges, or marriage difficulties, they have no extended family to provide perspective, assistance, or emotional support. Amanda achieved her goal of independence. But independence without community becomes a form of isolation that affects every aspect of family life. The irony is that Amanda's children will grow up without understanding what healthy family connections look like. Sophie is learning that families consist only of parents and children, that grandparents are distant figures who appear occasionally for birthdays and holidays, that support systems are professional rather than personal. She's being raised to expect the kind of isolation that Amanda created, not knowing that families can be sources of ongoing love, wisdom, and practical help throughout life. I've built a fulfilling life that doesn't revolve around waiting for my son and granddaughter to need me. My volunteer work at the animal shelter became a part-time job that I love. My book club evolved into a close circle of friends who've become chosen family. I've traveled, taken classes, pursued interests that I'd postponed during the years when I was focused primarily on being Michael's mother and emergency support system. But I've also experienced the profound sadness of watching my granddaughter grow up from a distance. missing the milestones and daily joys that grandparents typically share with their grandchildren. I've seen Sophie only a handful of times, always in carefully controlled situations where Amanda manages every interaction to prevent the development of any real relationship between us. The relationship I'd hoped to have with my daughter-in-law, one of mutual respect, shared love for Michael and Sophie, and the kind of family bond that strengthens over generations, never materialized because Amanda saw me as a threat rather than a resource. She approached our relationship as a zero-sum game where my influence had to be eliminated for hers to thrive, not understanding that healthy families can include multiple sources of love and support. Sometimes I wonder what our family might have looked like if Amanda had approached boundaries differently, if she'd sought to include rather than exclude, to share rather than control, to build bridges rather than burn them. Would Sophie have benefited from having two grandmothers who adored her? Would Amanda have found parenting easier with experienced family support? Would Michael have been happier maintaining connections with both his wife and his mother? These questions are unanswerable now, but they remind me that the choices we make in relationships have consequences that extend far beyond what we can predict. Amanda's decision to exclude me wasn't just about our relationship. It affected Michael's sense of family, Sophie's understanding of what families can be, and the entire trajectory of how their family would handle challenges and celebrate joys. The woman who'd accused me of being too controlling learned what it actually meant to control a family by eliminating anyone who might offer different perspectives, alternative sources of support, or additional love for the children. She'd achieved complete dominance over her family's structure, but dominance without collaboration became isolation without backup. The most profound lesson has been understanding that healthy boundaries enhance relationships while unhealthy boundaries eliminate them. Amanda confused cutting people off with setting limits, isolation with independence, control with strength. She'd wanted to be the only important person in Michael's life, but she'd succeeded so completely that when she needed help, there was no one left to call. I kept one photo from Sophie's early months, a picture Michael sent me when she first smiled, back before Amanda's boundaries became so rigid. In that photo, Sophie's smile is radiant and pure, and I can see Michael's happiness at being a father. It reminds me of what we all lost when Amanda decided that families should be small, controlled, and isolated rather than large, messy, and supportive. The daughter-in-law who'd wanted to cut me out had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. She'd eliminated the family support that might have made her life easier, removed the backup that could have prevented her mental health crisis from becoming so severe, and created the kind of isolation that she'd mistaken for healthy independence. When she'd finally understood what she'd lost, the bridges had been so thoroughly burned that rebuilding them was impossible. They thought they could eliminate me from their lives because I was too controlling, too interfering, too much of a threat to their perfect family unit. They had no idea they were destroying the very support system that could have carried them through life's difficulties, provided wisdom during challenging decisions, and offered unconditional love that didn't depend on performance or perfection. When they finally understood that boundaries without relationship become isolation without support, they discovered what it truly meant to handle everything alone, not because they were strong and independent, but because they'd systematically eliminated anyone who might have been strong for them when their own strength wasn't enough.